So Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we are going to discuss epithalamus in this video. And if you are following the whole video about the cerebrum and the diencephalon, you know this schematic diagram that I started with. And these were the thalamus, and between them there was this third ventricle. Posterior to the thalamus, superiorly, we have the habenular nucleus, which are two in number. And just beneath the nuclei, we have this pineal gland and a stalk with which the pineal gland is attached to the third ventricle. So you can say that the pineal gland and the two habenular nucleus, they together make the epithalamus. So you can see over here there are two habenular nucleus. These two are habenular nucleus and this is the pineal gland, and together these three structures are going to make our epithalamus. Just anterior to the pineal gland we have the third ventricle. So you can say that the pineal gland is having a connection or a stalk, and the stalk is connected to the third ventricle. So this habenular nucleus, so now if this is your thalami, just posterior-medial to the thalamus you have this pineal gland, and similarly here and here there will be the two habenular nuclei. So the habenular nucleus are posterior and medial to the thalamus. So now if you have a look at this diagram of the pineal gland, you can see where the habenular nuclei are located, and the two habenular nuclei are superiorly above the pineal gland. They are forming, so you can see just above the pineal gland the habenular nuclei are forming this habenular commissure, and just below the pineal gland we have the posterior commissure. As you can see, superiorly the two habenular nuclei are connected to each other forming the habenular commissure. Similarly, inferiorly we have the posterior commissure, and this whole thing is the pineal gland. This whole thing is the pineal gland. Now this is a general overview that the habenular nucleus is receiving the fibers from hippocampus through the fornix and from the amygdala through the stria medullaris. I will show that to you in a while. And now the axons from the habenular nucleus, they are sent to the tectum of the midbrain, the reticular formation of the midbrain, the nuclei of the interpeduncular fossa of the midbrain, and similarly thalamus. So major three portions of the midbrain and one of the thalamus, and the afferent fibers, the incoming fibers, they are coming from the fornix, from the hippocampus through the fornix, and from the amygdala through the stria medullaris. Let me show that to you. So I told you that from the amygdala the fibers will travel through this stria medullaris thalami to reach the habenular nucleus, and from the hippocampus, for example, the hippocampus is located inferiorly, so from the hippocampus the fibers will travel through the lower portions of the fornix to reach the habenular nucleus. So one fibers from the amygdaloid, they are coming from the stria medullaris, and from the hippocampus, let me show that to you. From the hippocampus the fibers will travel through the fornix. So from the hippocampus they will travel through the fornix to the habenular nucleus, and from the amygdala the fibers will travel through the stria medullaris thalami. Now about the habenular nucleus, it is integration center for olfactory, for the visual, and the somatic afferent pathways. Now we have the pineal gland and body. You know this pineal gland, I told you that it had a stalk, and this stalk was having connections with anteriorly with the third ventricle. On both sides there were thalami, and this was the stalk of the pineal gland having connections with the third ventricle. And we know that the pineal gland is located a little bit inferiorly, so you can also say that it is posterior to the thalami and posterior to the midbrain as well. The base of the pineal stalk has a recess for the third ventricle similarly, and the superior part had the habenular commissure and the inferior part had the posterior commissure. So look at this. These were the thalami, this was the third ventricle that was running in between them, and these were the pineal gland. And I told you that the pineal gland were located posteriorly to the thalamus, as well as they were located posteriorly to the midbrain. So you can see the collicula of the midbrain as well. Now the pineal gland has a stalk, and you know the stalk is continuous with the third ventricle like this. It is having a recess for the third ventricle. Now on both sides, or you can say superior to the stalk, we have the habenular commissure, and inferior to the stalk we had this blue commissure, which is known as the posterior commissure. And these are the two habenular nuclei that are located. So the two habenular nuclei plus the pineal gland, they always made the epithalamus. And superior to the epithalamus we have the superior to the pineal gland we have the habenular commissure. Let me show that to you as well with the schematic diagram as well. So consider these two markers are the thalamus, and in between the thalamus this region will be the third ventricle. Now posterior to the thalamus I am going to place this structure, which is the pineal gland, and this pineal gland is having this recess which is for the third ventricle. Now you understood this thing? So now these were the two thalami, and between the thalamus this was the third ventricle. This was the pineal gland posteriorly, and on both sides of the pineal gland we have the habenular nuclei. And I told you in between the pineal gland we had this commissure, this recess, which was known as the recess for the third ventricle. Now there will be a commissure which will be joining these two habenular nucleus, and it will be superior to the pineal gland. This commissure which is joining these two, it is known as the habenular commissure. Now there is this another commissure which will be inferior to the pineal gland, and this commissure will be known as the posterior commissure. So posterior commissure, which is inferior to the inferior to the pineal gland. These two habenular nucleus sidewise, and then we have the commissure which is connecting the two habenular nucleus. Just to orient it a little bit more, you can see that the habenular nucleus are now posteromedial to the thalamus. This was the third ventricle. This was the fissure for the third ventricle. This was the pineal gland. Inferior to the pineal gland, this is the posterior commissure. Superiorly, or on the sides of the pineal gland, we had this habenular nucleus, and the commissure that is connecting the habenular nucleus and is superior to the pineal gland is the habenular commissure. I hope you understood the whole concept with this schematic diagram. Now if we examine the pineal gland of ours, that was this pineal gland, so it had two types of cells, which are pinealocytes and the glial cells. And now you sometimes make jokes with your friends that your brain is filled with sand. So brain sand is actually a thing, and whenever calcium gets deposited in your pineal gland, so we call this brain sand, and it goes on with age. Like if you grow older, the brain sand or the concentrations of the calcified material in your pineal gland are going to increase. Now pineal gland has no nerve cells, rather it has adrenergic sympathetic fibers that are coming from the superior cervical sympathetic ganglia. That is one thing you need to know. Now the functions of the pineal gland. The pineal gland is now going to send impulses to the gonads, the pituitary gland, the adrenal cortex and medulla, the islets of Langerhans of pancreas, and the parathyroid gland. And how are this whole the fluids from the pineal gland are going to reach these substances? They are going to reach by the bloodstream or the CSF. The main thing about the pineal gland, it is inhibitory, and it inhibits the production of hormones. So now whenever it is going to act on these substances, it is going to inhibit the formation of the hormones or the releasing factors of these glands. And one other thing about the pineal gland, it is the part of the brain that is having no blood-brain barrier. You can say that the pineal gland is the place of the brain where there is a broken blood-brain barrier. Now we have one very important function of the pineal gland, that is to associate with the circadian rhythms. Now what happens is that the light is perceived by the retina of the eye. It goes into the suprachiasmatic nuclei. From that it goes into the tegmentum. From that it goes into the pineal gland, or it stimulates the release or inhibition of the melatonin. Let me show that to you. So what happens during the daytime? There is inhibition and the pineal gland is not activated. But during night time, during dark period, what will happen? It will stimulate the retina. The retina is going to stimulate the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is going to stimulate the pineal gland, and pineal gland will produce the melatonin, and melatonin is going to induce the sleeping cycle. So this is how nighttime stimulation is going to cause the pineal gland to secrete melatonin and influence the circadian rhythms. Now these melatonin, they are released into the CSF or into the third ventricle, because pineal gland is having a recess and it is having connections with the third ventricle, where they pass to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland and inhibit the release of gonadotrophic hormone. What will happen with the gonadotrophic hormone? Now at night time there will be no gonadotrophic hormone released, and your all the activities or all the functions of your body will be depressed. So let's have a recap. Till now, we studied that daytime will cause inhibition, but at night time there will be stimulation. The suprachiasmatic nucleus will be stimulated. It will go to the pineal gland, and pineal gland will now produce melatonin. Now this melatonin will travel through. So the melatonin that is produced from this pineal gland, now it will travel between the two thalamus through the third ventricle, and it will reach the pituitary gland in its anterior region. Now the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, in this it will cause the inhibition of the gonadotrophic releasing hormone, and when the gonadotrophic releasing hormone is inhibited, sleep cycle will be induced. So this is how your pineal gland induces the circadian rhythm. So with that, we have now ended the epithalamus. We will meet you in the next video related to hypothalamus and all the regions just before the lobes of the cerebrum.